The airport was busy with the hum of travelers, the rolling of suitcases, and the constant blur of people rushing to their gates. Among them, a man walked calmly, moving with a quiet authority that drew little attention but carried weight nonetheless. He was dressed in a simple dark suit, his tie slightly loosened after a long day, and sunglasses partially hiding the sharpness of his gaze. People around him didn't know who he was, and he preferred it that way. He wanted only to get through security and catch his flight home after a long day of work. As he approached the security checkpoint, he noticed the usual clamor, children crying, people fumbling with their documents, and the occasional frustrated sigh. He placed his bag on the conveyor belt, removing his jacket and placing it carefully in a tray as instructed by the security personnel. He tried to blend in, but there was a certain tension in the air, a sense that something was slightly off. A group of uniformed police officers stepped forward and intercepted him just as he was about to walk through the metal detector. One officer, taller than the rest and with a stern expression, asked for his identification in a tone that was sharp, almost accusatory. The man complied immediately, handing over his badge and identification without a word of protest. He explained clearly who he was and why he was there, trying to maintain calm in the face of growing hostility. The officers, however, didn't seem convinced. They exchanged glances, muttering under their breath, and insisted on taking him to a separate area for further verification. Confusion rippled through the small crowd that had begun to gather nearby. Some travelers whispered to each other, unsure of what they were witnessing. The man remained composed. He understood the situation was not just about him, but about the assumptions and biases that had led to this moment. He stayed quiet, letting the officers carry out their procedures while carefully observing their reactions. He noticed the tension in their shoulders, the hesitation in their voices, and the unmistakable undertone of prejudice in the questions they asked. Time seemed to slow as he was led to a waiting area. The area was crowded, but he stood out not because of arrogance, but because of the calm authority he carried naturally. Travelers continued to move around him, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Some tried to intervene subtly, offering reassurances that he had done nothing wrong, but the officers were too focused on their own rigid procedures to notice. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that patience and professionalism were the only ways forward. The officers, meanwhile, were growing increasingly flustered. Their repeated questions and requests for identification had not produced the response they expected. They were unprepared to deal with someone who responded with clarity, composure, and authority. Each answer he gave seemed to make them more nervous, though they could not admit it openly. Nearby, a security camera quietly recorded every moment. The man knew it, but he did not show concern. He understood that the footage would later speak for itself, capturing the truth of the encounter far better than anyone could explain in words. He also knew that being calm and respectful, even when others acted unjustly, would leave a lasting impression that would resonate beyond the immediate moment. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The officers continued their questioning, now consulting radios and writing notes trying to confirm his identity. The man observed quietly, noting the shift in their demeanor as they realized the gravity of their mistake. There was a subtle change in their posture, a slight hesitation in their movements, as if they were beginning to sense that they were dealing with someone far more significant than themselves. Throughout the ordeal, he remained aware of the surrounding people. He could see the travelers' reactions. Some were anxious, some curious, and others visibly angry at the treatment he was receiving. He understood that this incident was not just about him. It was about the way people could be judged unfairly based on appearances. He silently hoped that by remaining calm and professional, he could demonstrate the importance of fairness and respect in moments like this. He tried to make small gestures to ease the tension. A nod here, a slight smile there, an acknowledgement of the airport staff who had tried to help him. Each action was measured, deliberate, and human, emphasizing the contrast between his composed behavior and the officer's growing unease. He realized that every interaction mattered, not just for him, but for the people witnessing it. The officers' voices rose slightly as they debated among themselves, the confusion and bias evident in their tone. The man did not react. He stayed calm, his patience unwavering. He knew that any sign of anger or frustration on his part could escalate the situation unnecessarily. He relied on his experience and understanding of human behavior to navigate the moment with dignity. A few bystanders began recording with their phones, capturing the scene for posterity. Some were whispering about what they were seeing, shaking their heads in disbelief. The man noticed this but did not allow it to distract him. He continued to answer questions with clarity and precision, each word carefully chosen to maintain calm while asserting his identity and authority. As the minutes ticked by, it became clear that the situation was moving toward a turning point. The officers were now visibly unsettled, realizing that their assumptions had been wrong. The man's composure remained steady, a silent testament to the power of patience, professionalism, and calm authority. He understood that this was a test not just of the officer's judgment, but of his own ability to remain composed under pressure. He also thought briefly about the broader implications of what was happening. Prejudice, assumptions, and fear can lead even trained professionals to make mistakes. He hoped that this incident, once resolved, could serve as a reminder of the importance of fairness, empathy, and respect in all human interactions. Finally, one of the officers spoke into a radio, and the tone of the room shifted slightly. There was a pause, a moment of quiet reflection, and then a change in demeanor. The man remained observant, noting the subtle cues that indicated recognition of the mistake. He did not react immediately, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. In that moment, he understood that patience and integrity were the most powerful tools he had. By remaining calm and professional, he could influence the behavior of others, even in a situation that had begun with bias and misunderstanding. He continued to stand tall, his presence commanding attention without demanding it, a quiet reminder that authority and respect are earned through actions, not assumptions. The scene remained tense, but the first signs of acknowledgement from the officers began to appear. The man did not speak, did not gesture. He simply waited, embodying calm authority and the quiet strength that comes from knowing who you are and what is right. Around him, the world continued in its usual rush, but the small space of the waiting area had become a stage where human behavior, both flawed and admirable, was on full display. As he stood there, he silently prepared for whatever would come next, knowing that his response, as always, would set the tone. The airport, the officers, the travelers, all were part of a moment that, though stressful, had the potential to teach, to correct, and to leave a lasting impact on everyone who witnessed it. And he, with his calm resolve and unshakable patience, was ready to meet that moment head-on. The tension in the airport waiting area had grown thick. The officers continued their questioning, their voices now tinged with frustration and confusion. They had asked for identification multiple times, and each time, the man had calmly provided clear answers. But still their skepticism lingered, fueled by assumptions and bias that they could not easily shake off. Travelers nearby had begun to notice the unusual scene. Some stopped in their tracks, staring with wide eyes, while others whispered quietly, trying not to be noticed. The man remained composed, aware of the stares and whispers, yet he did not let them distract him. One of the officers, younger and less experienced, fidgeted nervously. His hands trembled slightly as he held a radio, calling for verification from an unseen authority. His voice cracked a little as he repeated the man's name and title, as if saying it aloud might somehow make it real. Another officer rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath, clearly frustrated that their careful assumptions had been so completely wrong. Yet neither of them dared to admit it outright. The man, standing with a quiet strength, noticed the subtle tension between the officers. He saw the unspoken communication, the brief glances and half-formed gestures that revealed their discomfort. He understood that they were realizing their error, but pride and fear kept them from admitting it. He stayed still, allowing them the space to confront their own mistakes while maintaining his calm authority. Every movement he made was measured, each word spoken with precision, ensuring that his composure would guide the situation toward a resolution rather than chaos. Nearby travelers were beginning to grow restless. Some tried to continue on their way but kept glancing back, curious or concerned about what had caused this unusual holdup. A few had begun recording on their phones, capturing the incident as it unfolded. The man noticed this and continued to act with dignity, understanding that the eyes of the public were now on the scene. He did not raise his voice or make any sudden movements. Hazy. As the discussion continued, the man noticed a subtle change in the officer's demeanor. They began to speak more cautiously, their questions less pointed, their tone softer. He remained patient, waiting for the moment when recognition of his true identity would become undeniable. The officers were caught between protocol and reality, unsure how to proceed, and the man's calm presence acted as a stabilizing force, preventing the situation from escalating further. He took a deep breath, keeping his voice low and even when responding to the officers' questions. Each answer was precise, clear, and respectful. He never raised his voice or showed impatience, even though the situation was deeply unfair. He understood that demonstrating restraint and professionalism would ultimately carry more weight than any confrontation or argument. Around him, the travelers continued to watch, some shaking their heads, some whispering, and some silently hoping the situation would resolve quickly. The man observed every detail, the subtle shifts in body language, the nervous glances, the fleeting signs of doubt. He recognized the humanity in each officer, even as they faltered. They were under stress and their bias had clouded their judgment. He did not let anger or frustration take over. Instead, he focused on guiding the interaction through patience and calm authority. Each moment became a silent lesson in respect, integrity, and professionalism. A young woman, an airport employee, approached and whispered to one of the officers, trying to verify his credentials quickly. The officer nodded but did not release the man immediately. There was still a lingering tension, a fear of admitting a mistake too soon. The man allowed the conversation to continue without interruption, understanding that rushing the process could make the officers defensive. He remained a figure of calm, encouraging them to confront their own uncertainty at their own pace. Around the waiting area, travelers were now fully engaged. Some were recording videos, others were whispering to nearby passengers, and a few had stopped in their tracks watching intently. The man noticed their reactions but did not let them distract him. He continued to answer questions patiently, maintain eye contact with the officers, and demonstrate that his composure was unwavering. His presence had become a stabilizing factor not just for the officers, but for the small crowd that had gathered. As the minutes stretched on, one officer finally spoke into his radio with a different tone. It was quieter, more hesitant, as though he was realizing the gravity of the situation. He began to repeat the man's name and title with more certainty, confirming the details that the man had already provided. The tension in the room shifted slightly. The man could feel it, though he did not react outwardly. He continued to stand tall, waiting for the moment when acknowledgement would come. A senior officer appeared, called in to help clarify the situation. His presence added a new layer of authority, and he immediately requested to see the identification and credentials. The man handed them over calmly, and the senior officer's eyes widened slightly as he read the documents. Recognition dawned quickly, and the younger officers looked on with surprise and a growing sense of shame. The man remained composed, allowing the recognition to take its natural course. The senior officer nodded and stepped back, giving the man space while speaking quietly with the other officers. The change in atmosphere was subtle but noticeable. The officers who had initially detained him now seemed smaller, unsure, and reflective. The man observed their body language, noticing the first signs of acknowledgement that their assumptions had been wrong. He did not rush or force an apology, understanding that genuine recognition had to come naturally. Travelers continued to watch, some now murmuring in disbelief. The scene had transformed from a simple security check into a moment of tension, reflection, and unexpected recognition. The man's calm authority had not only maintained order, but had begun to influence the behavior of everyone in the space. He remained a figure of composure, a quiet reminder that dignity, patience, and professionalism could shape outcomes even in moments of bias and misunderstanding. The officers continued to confer quietly, now with a new understanding of the situation. The man stayed still, his presence commanding without demanding, allowing the moment to unfold with patience. He understood that his role in this moment was not to chastise or confront, but to model calm authority and integrity. Each gesture, each word, each moment of quiet patience reinforced the lessons he hoped the officers would take with them. As the minutes passed, the senior officer finally addressed the others, speaking with clarity and authority. The tone shifted entirely. The recognition was now complete, and the younger officers began to relax slightly, though a mix of embarrassment and reflection remained. The man did not respond immediately. He allowed them to experience the consequences of their assumptions and to confront their own biases in their own way. His patience had created a space for learning and acknowledgement. The travelers, sensing the change in tone, began to relax as well. Whispers quieted and the small crowd watched with a mixture of relief and curiosity. The man continued to stand with calm authority, a reminder of the human capacity for patience, understanding, and dignity, even in difficult situations. Around him, the airport continued its usual activity, but the small waiting area had become a place where human behavior, both flawed and admirable, was being observed and reflected upon. Finally, the moment of recognition was complete. The officers understood the mistake they had made, and the tension that had dominated the area began to dissipate. The man had maintained his composure throughout, guiding the situation with patience, professionalism, and quiet authority. Travelers slowly resumed their journeys, carrying with them a story of calm leadership in the face of misunderstanding, a story that would likely be shared long after they had left the terminal. The man took a deep breath, preparing for what would come next, knowing that the resolution of this moment was only the beginning of a larger conversation. The officers had been confronted with their assumptions, their bias, and their own humanity, and he had remained the steady presence that allowed learning and reflection to occur. The waiting area returned to its usual rhythm, but the impact of the moment lingered, a quiet testament to the power of patience, dignity, and human understanding. The moment had shifted. The senior officer's arrival had changed the dynamics of the waiting area. The younger officers, once confident in their assumptions, now appeared uncertain, their posture slightly hunched, their hands restless. The man remained calm, standing with an ease that drew attention without demanding it. He could feel the eyes of the travelers on him, yet he paid them no mind. His focus was on the officers, on the delicate balance of authority, patience, and human understanding that this moment demanded. The senior officer carefully reviewed the man's identification and credentials. His expression changed slowly, from neutrality to recognition and finally to something resembling respect. He looked up at the others, silently signaling that they had made a serious mistake. The younger officers exchanged awkward glances, their earlier confidence replaced by a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. They had assumed authority without understanding the weight of the situation, and now they were confronted with the reality of their error. The man continued to observe, his demeanor steady, his posture unshaken. He knew that the recognition of his position was only the beginning. How the officers handled this realization would determine whether this moment could become a lesson or remain an uncomfortable memory. He remained silent, giving them the space to come to terms with their mistake, while his presence served as a subtle reminder of both authority and dignity. The waiting area, once filled with tension and whispered conversations, grew quieter. Travelers stopped moving, sensing that something important was unfolding. Some held their phones, capturing the moment, while others simply watched in silence. The man understood that these people were witnessing more than an airport incident. They were observing human behavior, the impact of assumptions and the power of calm composure in moments of confrontation. One of the younger officers, still nervous, finally spoke. His voice was quieter than before, tinged with uncertainty and hesitation. He repeated the man's name and title, as if saying it aloud might make the recognition more real. The senior officer nodded, confirming the details, and the tension in the room shifted further. The realization that they had detained a high-ranking official, someone they had underestimated, was sinking in. Embarrassment and shame mixed with relief, a complex blend of emotions that the officers struggled to process. The man did not interrupt. He remained patient, knowing that rushing the acknowledgement could make the situation more uncomfortable. He understood the human tendency to resist admitting mistakes, especially when pride and authority are involved. By standing still and composed, he allowed the officers to navigate their feelings while maintaining the integrity of the moment. His calmness acted as a guide, showing that strength often comes from restraint rather than confrontation. The senior officer finally spoke to the group, his tone measured and firm. He reminded the younger officers of their responsibilities and the importance of accuracy and respect in every interaction. His words carried authority but also empathy, acknowledging the stress and fear that can lead to mistakes. The man listened carefully, noting the subtle shift in tone, recognizing that this conversation was a turning point for the officer's understanding. The younger officers nodded, some avoiding direct eye contact, others glancing briefly at the man. There was an unspoken acknowledgement of their error, a silent promise to do better. The man allowed them this space, understanding that genuine acknowledgement cannot be forced. He remained calm, his presence a constant reminder that patience and professionalism were more powerful than anger or reproach. As the senior officer continued to speak, the man observed the reactions of the travelers around them. Some shook their heads, silently expressing disbelief at what had happened. Others whispered to each other, noting the behavior of the officers and the composure of the man who had been detained. The scene had shifted from a tense confrontation to a moment of reflection and learning, not only for the officers, but for everyone present. The man took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment. He knew that how he handled the next few minutes would influence the outcome further. He remained silent, allowing the officers to process their feelings and the implications of their mistake. His calm demeanor provided a safe space for learning, a subtle but powerful form of leadership that did not require words or gestures. One of the officers, the one who had initially been the most confrontational, finally spoke. His voice was low and hesitant, but it carried the weight of sincerity. He apologized, acknowledging the mistake and the assumptions that had led to it. The man nodded slightly, accepting the apology without displaying anger or judgment. His calm acknowledgement reinforced the lesson that mistakes, when met with patience and understanding, can become opportunities for growth. The other officers followed suit, offering apologies in their own ways. Some were more awkward than others, their words rushed and uncertain, but the sincerity was there. The senior officer guided them, helping to ensure that the acknowledgement was meaningful and not simply a formality. The man remained composed throughout, his patience allowing the officers to navigate their embarrassment and guilt without feeling rushed or pressured. The travelers around them continued to watch, some whispering in astonishment, others silently reflecting on the scene. The man's presence had transformed the atmosphere, turning what could have been a humiliating confrontation into a moment of accountability, learning, and human connection. The tension that had dominated the area was now replaced by a sense of resolution and reflection. The man allowed himself a brief moment of relief, knowing that the immediate crisis was passing. He had maintained his composure, guided the interaction with patience, and allowed the officers to confront their own biases. The scene around him slowly began to return to normal, with travelers resuming their movements, airport staff returning to their duties, and the officers regaining a measure of professionalism. Despite the resolution, the man knew that the lesson extended beyond the immediate incident. The officers had been confronted with their assumptions and their bias, and he had remained a steady presence, demonstrating the power of calm authority and patience. The travelers who had witnessed the scene had also been exposed to this lesson, seeing firsthand how human behavior can be shaped by composure, dignity, and understanding. The officers began to straighten their posture, their nervous energy dissipating as they recognized the gravity of the situation and the importance of their actions. The man continued to stand with quiet authority, his presence a reminder that leadership is often demonstrated not through words alone, but through behavior, patience, and integrity. The younger officers, though still humbled, seemed to gain a measure of understanding from the experience, realizing the impact of their assumptions and the importance of thoughtful action. The man finally stepped forward slightly, acknowledging the completion of the verification process. The senior officer gave a small nod, signaling that the situation was resolved. The younger officers exchanged glances, a mixture of relief and lingering reflection in their expressions. The man maintained his composure, walking calmly back to the main area of the terminal, ready to continue his journey. As he moved, the travelers who had witnessed the scene continued to murmur among themselves, sharing their impressions and reflecting on what they had seen. The man's calm presence, patience, and dignity had left a lasting impression, a demonstration of leadership and professionalism in the face of misunderstanding and bias. The officers, now aware of their mistake, seemed more thoughtful, carrying with them a newfound understanding of the importance of humility and careful judgment. The man found a quiet corner of the terminal to wait for his flight, reflecting briefly on the incident. He knew that while the immediate confrontation had ended, The lessons it carried would extend far beyond the airport. The officers had learned about the dangers of assumptions and bias, and the travelers had witnessed the power of calm authority and patience. In that crowded, noisy terminal, a small moment of human understanding had taken place, leaving a mark on everyone involved. The man's thoughts turned to the broader implications. Bias and assumptions are often subtle, unnoticed until they lead to mistakes or injustice. By remaining calm and composed, by demonstrating patience and professionalism, he had provided an example of how human behavior can influence outcomes positively. The incident would be remembered not for the initial tension, but for the resolution and the lessons learned. As the boarding announcement for his flight echoed through the terminal, he rose and gathered his belongings. The officers watched, some with quiet respect, others with a lingering sense of humility. The travelers who had observed the scene returned to their paths, carrying with them a story of patience, dignity, and human understanding that would likely be shared for years to come. The man walked toward the gate, his demeanor unchanged, calm and assured, a quiet testament to the power of patience, composure, and leadership in the most unexpected of circumstances. The tension in the airport had shifted into a quieter, more reflective atmosphere. The officers, now fully aware of the magnitude of their mistake, were visibly humbled. The man stood near them, maintaining the calm and composed demeanor that had guided the entire incident. He could sense the officers' internal struggle, the mix of embarrassment, guilt, and the realization of the assumptions they had made. He remained patient, allowing them to navigate their emotions while setting an example of dignity and restraint. One of the younger officers, the one who had been the most aggressive in his approach, took a hesitant step forward. His hands were slightly trembling as he spoke, his voice low and unsure. He apologized directly to the man, acknowledging the mistake and the unnecessary stress they had caused. His words were awkward, but the sincerity was unmistakable. The man nodded slightly, accepting the apology without any sign of anger. His calm acceptance sent a subtle message. Mistakes could be acknowledged without conflict, and accountability could be handled with dignity. Another officer followed, bowing his head slightly as he spoke. He admitted that their assumptions had been wrong and that their behavior had been unfair. He expressed regret not only for the immediate incident, but also for the way it reflected on their role as law enforcement officers. The man listened, his expression steady, demonstrating the power of listening and acknowledging human efforts at correction. His patience allowed the officers to speak freely and honestly, without fear of ridicule or further conflict. The senior officer, who had earlier intervened, guided the group through a process of acknowledgement. He reminded them that their actions had consequences, but also emphasized that the recognition of mistakes and the willingness to apologize were signs of strength, not weakness. He encouraged them to reflect on how bias and assumptions could influence behavior, urging them to take the lesson seriously. The man nodded in agreement, showing support without taking over, reinforcing the idea that responsibility and correction should be led with empathy and patience. Around them, the travelers who had witnessed the scene began to relax. Some whispered to each other, commenting on the unusual but powerful display of accountability. Others continued recording discreetly, realizing that this was more than just a security incident. It was a moment of human understanding and growth. The man, aware of the attention, remained composed. He did not seek recognition, but he understood the value of leading by example. His quiet demeanor spoke louder than words, showing that humility, patience, and dignity could influence everyone in the room. The officers continued to apologize, each in their own way. Some knelt briefly, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement, while others simply lowered their heads and spoke sincerely. The man accepted each apology calmly, reinforcing the idea that reconciliation and accountability could be handled with grace. He understood the human tendency to struggle with admitting mistakes, and by maintaining his composure, he provided a safe space for genuine acknowledgement. The young officers began to reflect on their actions more deeply. They realized that assumptions, even when subtle, could lead to serious errors. They had treated someone unfairly based on appearances, and now they faced the consequences of that behavior. The man's calm presence allowed them to confront their mistakes without escalating tension, showing that leadership often comes from demonstrating patience and understanding rather than demanding it. The senior officer encouraged the group to discuss what they had learned. He emphasized the importance of humility, awareness, and careful judgment in every interaction. The man listened quietly, occasionally nodding to reinforce the points being made. He understood that this discussion, though uncomfortable, was a critical part of learning. By allowing the officers to express themselves and reflect on their behavior, he was helping them internalize the lesson in a meaningful way. As the conversation continued, the atmosphere in the waiting area softened. The initial tension and fear had been replaced by a sense of reflection and accountability. Travelers continued to observe, some with curiosity, others with admiration for the calm and dignified manner in which the man had handled the situation. The incident had transformed from a moment of conflict into a powerful example of human understanding, patience, and professional integrity. The man finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. He acknowledged the officers' apologies and expressed hope that they would carry the lessons forward. He emphasized that fairness, respect, and humility were essential in every interaction, especially in positions of authority. His words were simple yet powerful, and they resonated with everyone present. The officers listened intently, understanding that this was not a reprimand but an opportunity for growth. One of the younger officers asked a question quietly, seeking guidance on how to handle similar situations in the future. The man responded with patience, explaining the importance of clear thinking, self-awareness, and empathy. He encouraged them to pause, reflect, and ensure that assumptions did not cloud judgment. His advice was practical and grounded, aimed at preventing future mistakes while reinforcing the value of integrity and respect. The senior officer summarized the discussion, highlighting the key points of accountability, awareness, and professional conduct. He reminded the group that every interaction mattered and that respect and fairness were fundamental to their role. The man nodded, supporting the summary, and his calm presence reinforced the seriousness and sincerity of the conversation. As the officers absorbed the lessons, the man allowed himself a moment to observe the environment. The travelers had resumed their activities, but the memory of the incident lingered. Some continued to whisper about what had transpired, reflecting on the unusual but powerful display of human understanding. The man's composure and patience had not only resolved the immediate conflict, but had also created a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed the moment. The younger officers, now more reflective, expressed gratitude for the guidance they had received. They acknowledged that the experience had been humbling and educational, and they promised to carry the lessons forward. The man accepted their words calmly, reinforcing the idea that growth and learning often come from moments of discomfort and reflection. The senior officer thanked the man for his patience and for providing a clear example of professional conduct. He emphasized that leadership could be demonstrated through calmness, composure, and the ability to influence others positively without force or intimidation. The man nodded, understanding that his role in the moment had been less about confrontation and more about modeling behavior that others could follow. The travelers continued to observe, some whispering to each other about the remarkable display of patience and accountability. Others quietly resumed their journeys, carrying with them a story that would likely be shared for years to come. The man remained composed, gathering his belongings and preparing to continue his own journey. His demeanor reflected both relief and satisfaction, knowing that the immediate conflict had been resolved and that the officers had learned a valuable lesson. As he walked toward the exit of the waiting area, the man felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had maintained his composure, guided the interaction with patience, and allowed the officers to confront their own assumptions and biases. The travelers who had witnessed the scene had also been exposed to the power of calm authority, patience, and dignity. In that crowded terminal, a small but significant moment of human understanding had taken place. The man found a quiet spot to wait for his flight, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. He knew that while the immediate incident was over, the lessons it carried extended far beyond the airport. The officers had been confronted with their own assumptions and biases, and the travelers had witnessed a model of leadership, patience, and human understanding. The impact of the moment would likely ripple outward, influencing behavior and attitudes long after the airport had returned to its usual rhythm. The man took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the weight of the experience. He understood that moments like these, though stressful and unexpected, were opportunities to demonstrate the best aspects of human behavior. By remaining calm, composed, and patient, he had influenced the officers, the travelers, and the environment around him. The incident would be remembered not for the initial confrontation, but for the resolution, the acknowledgement, and the lessons learned. As the boarding announcement for his flight echoed through the terminal, the man rose and gathered his belongings. The officers watched, some with a quiet sense of respect, others with lingering reflection on the lessons they had learned. The travelers who had observed the scene continued their journeys, carrying with them a story of patience, accountability, and human understanding. The man walked toward the gate, his demeanor steady and composed, a testament to the power of dignity, calm authority, and the ability to guide human behavior through example rather than force. The airport had slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Travelers moved with purpose, luggage wheels rolling across the polished floors, announcements echoing through the terminals. But in a small corner, a quiet sense of reflection lingered from the incident that had just taken place. The man who had been at the center of it all stood calmly, observing the space around him. He had handled the confrontation with patience and dignity, and now the ripple effects of that calm authority were beginning to show. The officers involved were quietly gathering themselves. The embarrassment and humility of the situation had not vanished, but their posture was different now. They stood with a sense of awareness they had lacked before, their conversations more thoughtful and reflective. They exchanged glances that suggested understanding had grown, and there was a mutual unspoken recognition of the lesson they had just received. They were no longer defensive, no longer caught up in pride. Instead, they carried the beginnings of accountability, a quiet acknowledgement that actions and assumptions mattered. The man continued to observe. He understood that this incident would remain with them far longer than the few minutes of confrontation. It was a moment of learning, and learning often requires humility. He had seen how quickly assumptions could escalate into conflict, how bias could influence behavior, and how patience, calmness, and clear communication could guide resolution. His quiet presence had been the stabilizing force, demonstrating leadership without aggression. Travelers who had witnessed the scene moved past, some exchanging words about what they had seen. Some were curious, others reflective. The man noticed how his actions, though quiet and composed, had influenced the environment around him. He had maintained control not through force or intimidation, but through integrity and professionalism. Every gesture, every calm response had contributed to transforming a tense situation into a learning moment for everyone present. Nearby, airport staff spoke quietly among themselves. They had seen many incidents over the years, but this one was unusual. The way the officers, initially tense and confrontational, had shifted to acknowledgement and humility had been striking. The man's demeanor had been the catalyst, guiding the scene from chaos to reflection. They discussed the incident in hushed tones, noting how a calm and composed approach could de-escalate tension and teach lessons without confrontation. The man moved slowly, gathering his belongings. He took care to keep his movements deliberate, composed, and unobtrusive. He understood that even the smallest gestures could carry meaning. He made brief eye contact with the officers, a subtle nod acknowledging the learning that had taken place. There was no need for words. The acknowledgement had already been communicated through patience, presence, and calm authority. The senior officer approached him quietly, his expression thoughtful. He offered a small nod and a word of thanks, recognizing the role the man had played in turning a tense situation into a learning moment. The younger officers watched, some still processing, others beginning to understand how their actions and assumptions could be improved. The man acknowledged the gesture with a calm, professional nod, signaling that the moment was complete, and that accountability and learning had been achieved without confrontation. The man found a seat near his gate, sitting quietly as he reflected on the events. The boarding announcements continued, passengers moved past him, and the sounds of a busy airport surrounded him. Yet there was a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had handled the confrontation with patience and dignity, allowing the officers to confront their mistakes, and in doing so, he had influenced the behavior of everyone who had witnessed the incident. He thought about the larger lessons. Bias and assumptions are subtle and can easily influence behavior without awareness. But with patience, calm authority, and professionalism, Moments of misunderstanding could be turned into opportunities for reflection and growth. Leadership, he realized, is not always about asserting power. It is often about modeling behavior that encourages others to do better. He had demonstrated that clearly today. The officers returned to their duties, now carrying a sense of awareness they had previously lacked. They spoke quietly among themselves, reflecting on the lessons they had learned. The man observed, recognizing that the impact of the incident would extend far beyond the immediate moment. They would carry the awareness of their own bias and the importance of patience and humility into future interactions. The man's calm and composed approach had transformed what could have been a moment of conflict into a lasting lesson. Travelers continued to notice the change in the officer's demeanor. Some whispered about what they had seen, others simply reflected silently. The man's presence had influenced more than just the officers. It had created a ripple of awareness throughout the terminal. People had witnessed the power of composure, patience, and integrity in handling a tense situation. They had seen firsthand how calm authority could guide behavior, influence others, and create understanding without aggression. As the boarding call for his flight echoed through the terminal, the man rose, collected his belongings, and made his way toward the gate. He moved with the same calm and deliberate composure that had characterized the entire encounter. The officers watched him leave, a mixture of respect and reflective thought on their faces. The travelers who had observed the scene returned to their own journeys, carrying with them a story of dignity, patience, and human understanding that would likely be shared for years to come. The man reached the gate and waited calmly, reflecting briefly on the events. He understood that his role had been simple yet powerful: to model behavior, maintain composure, and allow others to recognize and correct their mistakes. He had not needed to assert dominance or authority aggressively. Instead, he had relied on patience, professionalism, and human understanding to guide the situation to a meaningful resolution. As he boarded the plane, he took one last look at the terminal. The officers were now back at their posts, the environment calmer, and the travelers had returned to their routines. Yet the incident had left a subtle but lasting impression on everyone involved. The lessons of humility, patience, and awareness would continue to resonate. The man settled into his seat, thinking about the quiet power of human understanding and the impact of calm authority in moments of tension. The plane took off, rising above the city below. The man gazed out the window, reflecting on how even brief encounters could hold powerful lessons. The officers had learned about the dangers of assumptions and bias, and the travelers had witnessed the strength of calm composure and integrity. The experience, though stressful, had become an opportunity for learning, reflection, and growth. It had shown that human behavior could be influenced positively through example, patience, and dignity. He closed his eyes briefly, appreciating the value of the moment. Leadership is often measured not by force but by the ability to inspire understanding and change. Today, he had done just that. He had allowed others to recognize their mistakes, to apologize, and to learn, all while maintaining calm and professionalism. The lessons of the incident would extend far beyond the airport terminal, leaving a lasting impact on everyone involved. The flight continued smoothly, and the man remained composed, reflecting on the lessons of the day. He understood that while he had been at the center of an unusual and tense situation, the resolution had been achieved through patience, understanding, and the quiet power of example. The officers had been guided to humility and awareness. Travelers had witnessed the importance of integrity, and the incident had transformed into a moment of human understanding. As the plane soared toward its destination, the man considered the broader implications of the incident. It was a reminder that bias and assumptions can affect behavior, but patience, composure, and professionalism can guide resolution. Leadership is not about asserting dominance, but about modeling behavior that others can learn from. The impact of calm authority and human understanding can ripple outward, influencing countless interactions beyond the immediate moment. By the time the flight began its descent, the man felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The incident had been resolved, lessons had been learned, and a small but significant moment of human understanding had been created. He had maintained his composure, guided others to acknowledgement and humility, and influenced the environment around him positively. The story of the incident would live on, not in the tension but in the patience, dignity, and human understanding that had resolved it. As the plane touched down, he gathered his belongings, prepared to continue his journey. The incident at the airport would remain a powerful example of how calm authority, patience, and human understanding could transform moments of tension into opportunities for growth and reflection. He stepped off the plane, carrying with him the quiet satisfaction of having guided a challenging situation to a meaningful and lasting resolution, a testament to the strength of integrity, humility, and composure.